And when I started doing the comic, I found that you could actually make magic happen by writing things and changing the operating system of the universe.
My name is Patrick, but you can call me Brother Patch. I know nothing, and you should not take me at my word. What is a hypersigil? If you do a search for the word hypersigil on YouTube, you'll bring up a small handful of videos. Nearly every one of them will mention that the term hypersigil was coined by a Scottish comic book writer, Grant Morrison. And nearly all of them will go on to mention that the term describes a phenomenon that Morrison experienced when the events of his life began to mirror the events happening to the lead character of his comic book, The Invisibles. Morrison chose the term hypersigil because it seemed to him this was an expanded version of the sigil workings used in chaos magic. The sigil working was created by 19th century artist Austin Osman Spare. It involves creating a stylized glyph to represent a desired outcome, and then using that glyph to bring about a change in reality. Morrison's ubiquity in all of these videos makes sense. He coined the term after all. And despite the practice of hypersigils being potentially older than Morrison's use of them, in my opinion, no one has really publicly done much to further the practice. I originally did a YouTube search just looking for more information on hypersigils, or at the very least a standardized definition of what a hypersigil was. As someone who has had their life dramatically changed by what I took to be a hypersigil, I was interested. But as near as I can tell, no definition exists, so I set out to create one. The first places I turned in support for my quest were books. The first book was Grant Morrison's own Super Gods. It's part memoir, part history of Western comics, and Morrison's description of his experience with the hypersigil was enlightening to me. Besides that, the book itself is very entertaining. Morrison is as talented a prose writer as he is a comic book writer. The second book was Aidan Wachten's Weaving Fates. It has a chapter specifically devoted to hypersigils, and what I really liked about this chapter and Wachten's ideas was his assertion that hypersigils create feedback loops in our lives. The next book was Gordon White's Chaos Protocols, and whether you're working with hypersigils or just traditional sigils, I think White's ideas about shoaling and his concept of the robofish are essential to effective sigil magic. Next was Lon Milo DuQuette's Low Magic, and while this book doesn't mention hypersigils at all, his explanation of what magic is and why it works was meaningful to me, and it was an idea that I kept seeing echoed in other reliable but separate sources. That became a touch point for me in this work. The next book was kind of a dark horse. It was Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, and specifically Carl Jung's introduction to Wilhelm's translation. In it, Jung talks about synchronicities, and he draws a distinction between synchronicities and causality. That influenced heavily the way I look at hypersigils and their potential outcomes. Enough preamble, here's my definition. A hypersigil is a narrative model of the universe that shares psychic resonance with a potential phenomenon. Okay, let's unpack that definition. Let's start at the very beginning. A narrative model. So the narrative bit is important because that's what makes a hypersigil different from just a sigil. It's a more or less sequential chain of events that are being represented, and I mean sequential in the loosest sense of the word. I see no reason why a hypersigil couldn't have a Tarantino-esque quality if that's the way the creator wanted to make it. So by narrative here, what I really mean is kind of a change in state. That's what's being represented by this. Things are one way, something happens, things are now another way. It's a very Aristotelian idea of storytelling. So maybe it wouldn't have to be a story. Maybe an anecdotal hypersigil would work. To me, going back to something like the cave paintings of Lascaux, that those, even though they were just one single image, they represent a desired state. You know, there's the animal and it has the spears in the back, so the animal's natural state doesn't have spears in its back, so the spears in the back represent a change that the person who made the painting is wanting to bring into the world. And we should explain the model of the world bit too, not just the narrative bit. Model of the world is kind of something that we see in sympathetic magic. In Fraser's Golden Bough, he describes imitative magic, where a person makes a model, an effigy of the natural world, and then they create a change in that model, in that effigy, that they want to see happen in the real world. And so through some sort of imitative process, that change that happened in the model takes place in the real world as well. It's kind of like if you think about voodoo dolls. The voodoo doll is an effigy of a person, and if you stick a pin in the voodoo doll, then the person the doll's an effigy of feels the pain. I struggled a little bit with describing the outcome of a hypersigil. When a hypersigil works, it has a feeling of a Jungian synchronicity. And synchronicities happen apart from causality. So in describing the outcome, I didn't want it to seem like the hypersigil was actually causing the outcome to happen, because I'm not sure that that's what does happen. And as a Westerner raised in a rational culture, it's hard for me not to think in terms of causality. I mean, we're, physics and the way we look at the world all kind of say this happens, which causes this to happen. And it's hard to imagine something happening without a cause. But Jung, in his introduction to the I Ching, talks about how some moments just kind of share a resonance, that this and this are really alike, and so they kind of exist together in that sameness and that likeness without one causing the other. And as I continue to work with hypersigils, this is the hardest, strangest thing for me to wrap my mind around and to get to. And so I have no doubt as you're watching this, that's going to be a hard one for you too. And if I'm going to get pushback from anybody in different places, and especially from rationalists, I think this is the point that it's going to happen at, and that's fine. I don't claim to understand this. I don't claim to understand the workings. I'm just looking at it. I'm just experimenting with it to see what happens. And so in my language, sometimes I will betray my tendency towards cause and effect, towards causality. And so you'll probably catch me saying things and be like, that doesn't make sense if you don't believe in causality in these moments. So just bear with me, be patient. I'm trying to retrain my mind into this realm of resonance and less causality, if that makes sense. So just bear with us on that part. Finally, a probable phenomenon. Probable because it's like I said in the last little bit, it's not causing the thing to happen, but it's a resonant moment that is likely to happen or could happen. Gordon White talks a lot about that. What sigils and chaos magic in generally do is they push probabilities. So if I do a hypersigil to be the king of the moon, what's the probability of that happening? Well, since the moon isn't inhabited, since I have no way of making it to the moon, since I have no credentials that would recommend me to be king, then that's a lot of probabilities to push to get me there. But if I do a hypersigil that gets me like a really big tip when I'm driving Uber, well, that's a smaller boulder to push up a hill, because I'm super charming and I actually drive Uber, and so that big tip isn't that improbable. So that's what I mean when I say probable. What is something that is within the realm of probability? And the closer it is to happening in the realm of probability, the easier it is to cast for those sort of things, I think. Phenomenon was the next, I didn't want to say outcome, even though I've said it a couple of times during this, because like I said, I'm trying to avoid causality. So outcome feels like causality. And I didn't want to say event because that, to me, event kind of cements it in chronology. Like it is going to be in the future, or it's a time that you can point at and say, this is the exact moment that this happened. And I don't know, first of all, that hypersigils are bound by chronology. They could work retrocausatively for all I know. And also, I don't know that the changes are necessarily a thing that you can point to on a calendar and say, this is when the hypersigil worked. Because, as I'll talk about in future videos, I think the vast majority of outcomes that you would get from a hypersigil don't happen in outside reality. I think they happen inside you, in your inner world. The changes that you're trying to make with a hypersigil may look like outer world changes, but those are accomplished through inner world changes, in my opinion. And I say the majority. I'm not, I'm not trying to lay down dogma here. But because the changes happen inside of you, like that may occur over time. That may, who knows how interchanges inside of us occur. And so that's why I say phenomenon instead of event or outcome or anything. So anyway, that's my definition. That's why I chose the words that I chose. I do not, even though this is a definition, I do not view it as definitive. I do not view it as unchangeable. I have no idea that I will change it as I go, but I will change it based on my experience, based on me. Right now, I'm working with hypersigils every week, and I'll talk more about what that looks like in a future video as well. But because of that, I'm existing in the laboratory of hypersigils on a week-to-week basis. I have the opportunity to form opinions and form definitions based on my experience. And I think that's, you could come up with a strictly academic definition based on what you've read, but we got enough people reading about stuff and assuming they understand it based on that. So I want to try and understand it from a boots on the ground perspective. So I would love to hear your opinions on the definition. I'd love to hear pushback. I'd love to hear if you have an opinion. If you're someone who's working with hypersigils in the real world on a regular basis, I want to hear from you. I want to know, who are the other guys out here who are doing this? I know a few names from YouTube that, have done 1 or 2 videos on the topic, but this is kind of where my attention's at right now, and so I'm kind of chasing it. So I would love to know if you're chasing it too. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.